All right, listeners. Well, viewers, I should say. With we're kind of digging into the whole video element of Fortress on a Hill, which I think appropriate given just the handsomeness of my co-host mainly. And like you'll suffer me, but it'll be worth it in the long run. And our guests are better than us traditionally. You know, do we bring on a lot of baby boomers? Sure. Sure we do. But but they're the silver fox variety, whether male or female. So anyway, we started this episode 0, I guess sub-series or temporary series, whatever you want to call it, where we're going to start with the three of us. We did me first. I guess that was about a week ago. We released that, and we're going to do all three of us. And then we're going to kind of bring on some of the folks we know, probably a lot of our regulars, folks that have been friends of the show for a while, active in the anti-war movement and the veteran movement, maybe even just some of our favorite scholars and voices, and do really what is, episode 0. What does that mean? Well, like start point, backstory. Maybe we should have done it right in the middle, right in the beginning, but you got to build some kind of audience and credibility. And now let's like take a flashback, like a good film or like a really cheesy bad film, but just like a film, take a step back and say, okay, what's the context? What's the backstory of this person? I'm obsessed with that as a historian, a geek, and just in general, like a cinematic kind of minded person. And I think a lot of folks are actually deep down. And so, I do a lot of talking on the show sometimes and in life and when it's inappropriate. So let's just be clear about that. But, Henry's, I think in a lot of ways, viewers would say, he'll tell his story, he'll make his point, but he's less likely to be indulgent. I mean, I think personality wise, less likely to be like, let me just tell you about how I experienced this for the next 12 minutes, there are other people on the show, maybe hosts, that not so much, right? But I think that this is a particularly interesting episode because I don't know everything about Henry's story. So this is not canned, right? And I doubt Keagan does, right? This kind of isn't a canned interview. So we're gonna dig back to his past, and then we're gonna do the same thing with Keagan, and then we're gonna do the same thing with some of our favorites, and see how long this goes on. And that past goes pretty far back, and I think in general, whether it's Henry, Keagan, myself, and then certainly most of the people we sort of roll with, at least the ones we started rolling with that are regulars. I said this in an email and a social media post about episode 0 that I did. We are clearly not special in a way of being better than others, whether it's us or just other people in the broad kind of veteran anti-war movement. But one thing is sure, every one of the people who kind of fits that vague description has been through 2 fairly profound pivots in life. And they're no small thing, right? So the first one is voluntarily, post-Vietnam, the draft is gone, right? Voluntarily, to some extent, large extent, I would like to sign up for an institution in which it is part of the deal, basically, that I may very likely kill or be killed many thousand miles from home. Okay, that's a strange thing, right? I mean, we know about 1% of folks serve on active duty. So mathematically, it's strange. I think conceptually, it's strange. And then the second one is, at some point, right? Not saying there's necessarily heroics in this or even a moral at the end of the story, but at some point, the people who fit this vague description, like Henry, we're going to talk about today, made another profoundly pivotal and rare to some extent decision. Oh yeah, all of that I signed up for, that became my identity, I'm not, no thank you. Not only no thank you, but no thank you, and I have to say some shit about it to others. And I'm sick enough in the head to think that people should care what I think, right? There's a lot of stuff going on there, and I think that the backstory that is important. So with that long intro, I'm going to kind of jump right here into episode 0, right? Chris Henri Henrikson, and it's always funny because when we book guests and stuff, a lot of times they'll say to me, "Oh, Chris did this," or "Make sure you say something like this to Chris." I'm like, "Chris, who's Chris?" And I'm like, "Oh, right there." They don't get the nickname. So, all right, Henry. All that being said, I want to go back. I mean, I want to go like really back. So I want to know about, and the listeners I think are going to be interested to know, where you're born and primarily raised, and what kind of kid are you and I want it to kind of almost stop at the point where you're seriously like of age and thinking like I'm going to go into the military. So I mean, so this question really covers, and I'm not saying you weren't thinking about the military as a kid. I think you were watching the same movies as me, right? But what were you like? What was your experience like before it was a tangible thing? Like I'm probably going into the military and soon.
I want to say it was like maybe 12 or 13 when I really latched on to that I want to join the military vibe. Um, Part of it was my family, legacy, having a whole bunch of people in uniform, and I didn't know how varied the experience was as a kid. Um, you kind of just stack those in the same columns when people tell you about I served in the Navy or I served in the Marine Corps. If you don't have a concept of it, and then you fill in what's left from the movies. You bring in those characters, some of which are very well written, but are very absurd to exist in real life in great numbers. The biggest one that I'm thinking of right now was Vincent Hanna from Heat, um, and it was kind of his backstory of that he had been in the Marine Corps, and then he went and got a master's degree, and now he's this LAPD homicide detective lieutenant. I mean, he's in charge of his own section. Um, that all the different roles that I saw from movies, TV shows, and the few stories that I did hear from my family or read about elsewhere, it gave me that composite of I wanted to be a cop of some kind, but I was going to be in the military first. Why? Because all these people that I saw had been in the military first, and there's a lot of other connections between the military and police work. It's in some ways a very natural transition for people in this service because of the regimented nature of it, following rules and orders, filling out the required paperwork for whatever it happens to be. Um, but separate from that is I had as a kid, and this is as me as a young kid, as far back as I'd say I was when I was 5, I had this concept of wanting to help people, and I was very much attracted to the hero portion of helping people. But more than that, I was concerned about a authentic version of helping people. That I did not want to be the cop arresting homeless people for crimes that they can't control. I wanted to be able to go up head to head with the bad guys, the real hardened criminals. And it's not that police don't deal with them, but we don't deal with them in the way that films portray those things. But anyway, but I really latched onto this idea of wanting to help people, and that was my first layout of what that was going to look like. Going in the military, going to college, and then joining law enforcement somewhere. And it very much felt like a given. It felt like that. Yeah, yeah. Later on, I could be in the FBI. Later on, I could work for the NSA. Um, it was much more, I think, about the myth than the reality. Um, yeah.
So it's interesting that sort of a sense of like an inevitability or a fatedness to what you're gonna be. Isn't it, I find it interesting that sometimes at a very young age we write like a narrative for ourselves, almost like we write a plan or a script, and then at some point you wonder if am I playing out a script or do I still believe in the script, and then you wonder when it starts. And I think everyone maybe goes through that to a certain extent. But to just back up a little bit, um, if you're comfortable with it, tell folks about just kind of where, when we're talking, and maybe just the kind of kid and teenager you were outside of military aspirations. Like, what were you like, right? Were you like, where were you? What year was it? Like, I know how old you are. Not everybody might. Like, what was life like, and how did you respond to the stimuli of the universe, right? Like we all do.
Um, I was a pretty quiet kid. I I suffered from a lot of anxiety and just general I wouldn't say simply just fear of the unknown, but it was about people. You know, it wasn't about the rest of the world, but it was. But I was a pretty quiet kid. I stayed to myself. Um, you know, I had friends at school and played and stuff, but generally, you know, when I came home, I was usually a pretty solitary person. Um, the my parents got divorced when I was 2, and between the age of 2 and 12, I lived in, I think, 5 or 6 different places, and it was that going back and forth, along with disrupting some of my better relationships with grandparents, that it made me fearful. You know, I don't mean I was afraid of my own shadow, but I was very passive with people. You know, I let people's personalities and ideas fill the room before mine, and it would take someone quite a while to break that down. And I was close to a few people. I can mention my grandparents of different kinds. I always felt really blessed that way, that I had, you know, I had 6 grandparents when I was born. Even today, my 3 grandmothers are all still alive, and so their presence in my life was comforting and helpful. But yeah, I was kind of a fearful kid, and for that reason, you know, there were a lot of things that I just avoided out of not wanting to take the chance. And that meant sometimes not reading books that looked interesting, or not going to play games with people that, you know, seemed intimidating. And I thought that one of my connecting this back to being in the military is that I thought being in the military would kind of shake me out of that a little bit. That there, you know, the toughness quotient of basic, and of the regiment of being in the service. Um, and it certainly made me tougher, but it didn't change that part of me. You know, I was looking to change something fundamental about myself that was always going to be a part of me. No different than my time in the service is an indelible mark on who I am. Um, and But yeah, I was pretty quiet. I liked my TV shows. I liked reading to a certain extent. I really love comic books, but comic books didn't come around much. And being in a small town, it wasn't something that they stocked on shelves, so I didn't really look for it too much. Am I answering your question,
Yeah,
Danny?
absolutely. So I got two more follow-ons to that, of course. Details. Yeah, so it's interesting what you just said. 'Cause I was going to ask if maybe, as a function of some of that personality and experience driving personality, but of course it's always chicken egg, nature nurture. But that experience as you describe it, I was going to ask if you felt like maybe you were looking for a certain confidence or social and professional identity building in the military. Sounds like you were. Did it make the prospect of traveling and kind of moving about and like, leaving your high school friend group like some people are scared to do? Did it make all that seem less daunting that you had kind of been a little bit moving a lot throughout your life and like a little less settled?
That part of it was much easier for me.
Mm.
um, you know, moving from place to place, and I think the average that I did is that while I was in, I moved on average every 7 months, and that was between 3 different deployments, two combat deployments, and then one for Noble Eagle. Um, but yeah, I think that was definitely a lead in for me, a chance to a hopefulness that I could, you know, kind of snatch out of myself those parts that I considered to be weak to a certain extent, but also kind. You know, that there's some that the military, I don't think it breeds it out of you. I think the environment pushes it to the edges. That kindness is something that part of it, we don't have time. You know, we think about there's not enough hours in the day, and in the military you really learn that. Even if you put in a solid day's work, there might be 6 more coming, but you understood it, and that part of it was easier to me. um, you know, I knew what I was going to do, and as far as being a soldier, I kept my mouth shut and I did my job, and nobody bugged me. And that's a different subject about not being bugged, because my NCOs let me skip out on a record PT test at one point because they didn't realize that I wasn't in one of the two groups that was supposed to be doing it. We were doing shift work. You were either in group A and group B, and my name wasn't in either, and I wasn't going to challenge that. And it ended up that I missed it, which meant that a promotion that came around, 18 months later took longer because they wanted to put me in for a waiver for specialist, and I didn't have a recent enough record PT test. But that's kind of in my nature, I don't want to upset I never think about it this way, but I'm trying not to upset the balance around me, that I don't contribute to making the balance worse for myself, and especially worse for anybody else. I'll take care of anybody else before I take care of myself. I'm good. I would definitely be that asshole on the plane who puts his kid's mask on first and then puts his own on, because that's just the kind of person I am.
That's I have something on that as well that interests me. So before I turn it over to Keagan, though, I want to pause in high school. Then I have something to follow on about the actual joining of the army, which you can maybe briefly cover, and then Keagan's going to take over for a bit. But okay, where and when were you? Your junior year in high school. Like what year was that, and where were you going? Where did you live?
I lived in my hometown town of the Dalles. Um, that's about an hour east of where I live now, in the Portland area. Um, I was the single biggest influence at that time was that I was a police explorer. So my life was, I could put in as many hours doing it as I wanted to. And I did that an awful lot. Um, but I did that, and then I took a break during that summer, the summer of '01, before 9/11, and I spent 12 weeks helping my grandfather remodel his house. And he's since passed, so that's a really special memory for me doing that. Um, and then on the 13th of September 2001, I was at MEPS, and I was sitting there with they have these little staging areas in front of giant TVs to kind of keep pacify people as they're waiting to do tests to join the military. And back in the days when a big screen TV was just massive in size, you could never mount it on the wall. But here's these group of kids, anywhere from as young as 17 through their early 30s, um, absorbing all of this pain and trauma, and trying to find somewhere to channel it, trying to to deal with it. And the three of us have heard no end of people discussing how it was somewhere a part of their calculus of joining the military, whether small or large. If you joined after 9/11, it was a portion of your decision. Um, Sorry, Danny, anything more specific about my
Yeah,
junior
no, no.
year?
So, and so you were a delayed entry
Yeah.
then, right, right. Which, can you maybe just explain really briefly what the delayed entry program is in terms of enlisting for folks who might not know?
Um, Delayed enlistment allows you to actually sign up for the military earlier than age 18, but it's when they know you're going to graduate from high school, or possibly college if that comes around, and you've just done everything much further ahead of time. And so I had been in process there when I was 17, getting the permission of my parents, because your parents have to sign to be able to do that. And but that had me working on, getting in pretty early in my life. And I had done a lot of work talking to the recruiters and research and stuff before 9/11, because that process did begin then. I was like you were, Danny. I wanted to join the military pre 9/11. Um, but that ended up, it certainly still had a great impact. But when 9/11 happened, it did really shift a lot of those ideas and feelings. But yeah, delayed enlistment. It also the thing that I really liked, especially nowadays that I'm out of the army, is that your delayed enlistment time prior to actually signing on the dotted line and raising your right hand and joining, it takes time from your individual ready reserve. Because anybody who enlists, it's a minimum of an 8-year enlistment. Now that may be 2 years active duty and 6 years individual ready reserve, or mine was 6 and 2, but I got an additional 9 months off my individual ready reserve time, that other guys did not. And I was counting those days after I got out. I was like, well, there it goes. The military cannot recall me back at this particular point. I mean, there's a much further war themed way to do it, but generally speaking, they weren't going to do that. And that was really important to me because that's, at the time, there were so many specialties that were undermanned, and they were offering not ridiculous but modest bonuses to get people either to come back in. But MPs were certainly a big part of that.
So, and Kate's going to ask you about MP work. Okay, so I'm constantly going back and forth. But so your junior year, which is the last one that you're not in the process, basically, of getting into the military, is 2000 to 2001, right?
Yep.
So, okay, let's pause in that general moment, and to the extent that you can remember, you know, that year, the year before you're kind of soldierly, right, or at least officially so. You know, what are your favorite movies, bands, and, you know, TV shows, and why did they resonate with you? I mean, even in a brief sense.
I had been trying to absorb as much war films as I could stand, and I say that because it seeing that kind of destruction to people, it even in a cinematic context was really difficult for me to swallow. But I watched Saving Private Ryan. I watched Band of Brothers. Band of Brothers, I think, is one of the more accurate depictions of what combat is really like, about the variance between we're going to die right now and we're stuck in a really cold foxhole and it's 40 below out, but that wax and wane between the, you know, the sheer terror and the immense boredom. Other stuff like that, you know, CSI, I want to say early CSI was a big thing there, and that you know, that really pushed me into the mentally believing that the scientific realm of criminal justice was more accurate, which it isn't. It all has to be checked by science, and a lot of the stuff that we see on there nowadays isn't accurate, or at least is misleading in how it actually works. But I also, you know, I love sitcoms. I watch Friends. I was never really a Seinfeld fan. But yeah, lots of sitcoms and stuff around that time. And police movies. The Siege, one that we reviewed recently with Tom Secker, was very, very powerful to me because you know, I really related to Hubbard, you know, the Denzel Washington's character, that his leadership, his calm when everyone around him was not calm. And I'm sure that you know, in real life, we know that that's exceptionally not easy to be able to maintain something like that. But yeah, I think that was about it. Sitcoms, war movies, and cop stuff to a certain extent. So
I'm going to generally leave it to Keagan to kind of talk about the intro into the military and the MP experience. But I just wanted to make a statement that, you know, not to encapsulate you in my own sentences, but just, you know, what I know of you, in our personal relationship, and then also just hearing you kind of talk about it on the show, and a little bit of a different inflection, you know, because we haven't really talked these specific questions.
sure.
I mean, I've noticed in my own experience, like, that I think it would surprise a lot of folks who aren't like well acquainted with military life, that, you know, the archetypal enlistee, even in the combat units, right? Even like the scouts, and I mean, MPs did a whole lot of fighting, you know. I mean, it turned out MPs were like a hardcore combat branch, even if that wasn't necessarily always the view. But even in those elements, I mean, I've always found that the archetypal enlistee in the American all volunteer force is often less frat boy meathead and more introverted, small town, fantasy kind of tech geek,
Yeah.
socially searching. I mean, in other words, what you're describing might surprise people to know that that's not atypical. And I'm sure you found that there were like others that were pretty similar, right?
Yeah.
I mean, don't get me wrong, there's a lot, there are frat boys, there are meatheads, and there are even sociopaths, right? Probably in larger numbers than there are in the society at large, but that's not the rule at all. It may even not even be the standard. So I think that's interesting, but I've taken enough time. Keagan, take it from here for a minute, or several, for many.
I think that's also really indicative of our generation, I think, as like millennials, like older millennials, like we grew up like pre-internet, but also like the internet was still very much a part of our lives. So like of our growing up, so we still had that mentality and that like understanding. And yeah, I love that. I love what you said about depth too, because I was in depth for like 7 months, and so I was really blown away when I found out like, oh shit, my thing ended like when I signed those initial papers, not when I went to boot camp 7 months later.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So that was like, oh shoot, like, oh, I'm done faster than I thought I am. Cool.
Such a great
But
feeling.
yeah, it was really nice to do. It was like, oh shit, yeah. So like, so you have the fun boot camp experience. Um, was there anything from boot camp or AIT that really stood out to you as like particularly memorable, or like a moment where you realize like, oh shit, I'm like in the military now?
Um, Basic training, especially at the beginning, seemed to be a place where they didn't want people to breathe. They didn't want them to be able to stop and pause. It was about pushing forward and seeing how well and often how much you could push forward in a variety of things. Um, but basic for me was another one of those situations where my personality, I wanted to maintain a low profile. I wanted to, um, I certainly wanted to do well, and I wanted to learn everything I could. Um, but it was, the environment is, it's just brutal. That and not so much the physicality of it wasn't ever terribly hard for me, aside from being moved from the C group to the B group, and in running in basic training they break all the runners into tiers. Each C group is a little bit more slow, and
Hmm.
the A group is everybody that can just go like freaking horses, and then everybody else that doesn't fit into either ends up in B. Um, but it was you got pulled along, and that was something that happened in basic and didn't happen in a lot of the rest of the army, was that trying to incorporate the whole group and acknowledge the whole group. Um, but it really depends on the people, that the everybody seemed to react to basic in different ways. There were the more meathead types. My battle buddy, my bunkmate, there was definitely one of those types. He had come from a long military background, and he wanted, he wanted to be something. He knew that the army was his. I don't feel weird saying destiny, but I think that's probably the closest thing there. Um, Moments that really stuck out. Um, I'm a little claustrophobic, so wearing my gas mask for the gas chamber was exceptionally hard, and it squeezes to your face. That was the thing for me. It was just like you would breathe in, and it just pulls it into your skin. And I already had a, not a terrible but a reasonable level problem with claustrophobia, and so that was, I was holding the mask out a half an inch right at the door to the gas chamber, and then we'd go in. I'd sealed it. I'd talk myself through having it sealed, and then get out. But um that was a hard one, and also because it was, that they're trying to get people through, so there's lots of screaming. The military is full of random people yelling, even when you don't think the thing is terribly important. It just ends up getting yelled at you, and somehow that's supposed to help you accomplish stuff. um Once the MP part of basic training began, which I did, it was a one station unit training. I didn't leave or go anywhere else. I was in my company of new MPs at Fort Leonard Wood for the entirety of that time. And part of it was great, which meant that you could make friends that you actually got to hang out with a little bit longer. And you also got to kind of absorb the culture a little bit more. You saw, drill sergeants weren't supposed to cuss. It wasn't that they didn't cuss, it's that they weren't supposed to. But you'd see lots of innovative ways for them to curse at you and yell at you without using profanity. and scuttlebutt about it was the first sergeant gonna ever let us get discmans and or have a little bit of space, go on pass and have a little bit of fun. And um, but it was yeah, I don't I yeah, it was just crunch time for me the whole time. My brain was always working, and thankfully, sometimes that physical exhaustion can soak up some of the anguish of mental exhaustion because you just got to sleep. You're just that tired, and you get that break, and okay, 2100 has come. I go to bed. I even went to bed early a lot. The other guys were still polishing boots and stuff, and I had already done all that, and I was just tired. I went to sleep. um, the miracle of getting the occasional 6 o'clock wake up as opposed to 4:30. It felt miraculous to get that little bit of time. Um, um, yeah, I'm not sure I'm answering your question, Kay. I trying to think of more specific parts of it.
What did you like about when you were, actually learning your job and actually like being like, okay, here's what I'm going to do beyond the like soldier stuff?
Sure,
I
sure.
always feel like the army focuses so much more on being a soldier and like like at least I mean because I was stationed at an army base, so like I just got to see it all
Yeah,
day
yeah.
every day.
Um, the train up to become an MP was fun. They have I can't remember the name of the village. It might be Potemkin Village, but I'm maybe messing that up. But anyways, it was a little faux city that we actually went on patrol in. We got old school Chevy Lumina cop cars that had been changed just a little bit, and in this, it wasn't a very big area. But we actually had to get in our cars and call on the radio and call in, and we got a call and would go to these places. Um, and sometimes, a lot of them were pretty canned. They weren't. I didn't feel like I learned a ton in any individual moments, but there were some where they did better. They really, they let the whoever was playing the town drunk or the place drunk at the time, really yell at you, and you have to find a way to remain calm. And it's basic. They don't actually touch you, but the being able to deal with that anguish and still stay calm was a huge part of it. I very much like the investigative part of being an MP, finding out what happened, talking to people about what happened, and that was something that I, of course, got to do a lot more when I worked at the Fort Lewis drug team. Um, but no, I really did cling to some of those MP tasks, those other things, and wanting to learn how to do my job. I at the time I was still mentally saying these are some of the first building blocks. I was an explorer, and then I went to do the MP thing, and I thought that I was creating, layering knowledge on myself, and I was. It just wasn't nearly as useful as I believed it would be.
What like when you actually became an MP, like once you finished schooling and everything, how much time was there between that and your first deployment?
Um, the first one was going to DC to check IDs at the Pentagon. I got to Fort Lewis on the 3rd of January, and we landed in DC on February 22nd. So like in that time, that was all just straight up deployment prep. There was no, wasn't working patrol or doing anything else MP related at Fort Lewis, but it was a very, very quick turnaround. I was 3 days into Fort Lewis when the operations NCOIC, the non-commissioned officer in charge, came and told me, "Hey, this is what's happening. You're leaving in just a little bit." And um, I didn't mind. I had just gotten there, so in that part of it, I didn't care. I always hate packing up my crap, but that's a that's a different problem. But it was very quick. We got to DC there towards the end of February, and then it was the next month that Operation Rocky Freedom was launched. And so our time both before we left Fort Lewis and when we got to DC was hearing about our sister companies getting ready to go, and our essentially our entire battalion minus my company was going to Iraq. And I like that I had that extra time to process it a little bit, but I did feel a bit like I was missing the show. I kind of, and it was especially after being there at DC and seeing how I don't know that we were useless because they needed the manpower, but it felt a bit like a waste. Um, but it was a really neat experience to be there, to literally work in a guard shack next to the side of the Pentagon that had gotten hit by the plane when 9/11 happened. Um, and then, but the other part of it was, and this was a little more impending doom, was we knew we were going. We weren't sure January through maybe March or April next year, but we were going. And so I had 8 or 9 months to kind of mold that around a little bit. And I think that it made it easier. Part of it is that you don't know what you're going to be doing until you get to the deployment. Missions could literally change while you're on the plane between the United States and Kuwait, that you could end up doing something entirely different. And for being an MP, that was, it was, I don't know if we want to call it the spice of life, but it was very widespread. We did good security for convoys. We would go sit on IEDs if we happened to find one. Of course, being MPs, we worked with the local police a whole lot, and sometimes the Iraqi army, but mostly it was police. We got attached to a Cav battalion for a while, and when they were doing a huge operation, we were doing security for their S3, their operations officer for the battalion. I remember that was one of the first times I ever got shot at, was that night. And it was unnerving because the shots were coming from behind me over my head. And so I couldn't actually look towards the realm of any targets. I had to entirely rely on the other guys that were, like, we have our trucks spread out 360, so we're providing security. But no, it was incredibly varied when that time came around. As far as like deployment tempo, I was really lucky. So I came back from Iraq and I was home for a little over 2 years before I went back. Most guys in that period cannot say that. Other sister companies in my battalion at the time could not say that. So it's that was really fortunate that I did get that time, and I had no intention up until the very end of returning to a line MP company. I had already submitted my packet to CID to become a CID agent, and so I thought that my time doing those kind of combat support roles was going to be over. And then things changed. The surge happened. They scooped up every available MP from any corner of Fort Lewis that they could, and because I had recently said that I had withdrawn my packet, that for personal reasons I didn't want to go down that road, and I knew by doing so I was going back to Iraq. There was no way around it. But I was fortunate to have that time. Okay, I hope I answered your question in there. I get lost way too easy these days.
Well, so Henry, one comment and then backing up to like your view of the wars between the time you leave the Pentagon and then leave for Iraq. The first one is, again, I think it's interesting to remind folks who either may have never known or may have sort of forgotten, because like I've said so many times recently on interviews, the Iraq War is ancient history to most Americans now. It's like off-putting in a way. In some ways, I'm like, it is good to forget because it was a horror show, but like, man, I hope we don't forget some of like the lessons, but people don't remember that, I think. And I know enough about MPs to be dangerous because I worked with a lot of them, and I had a very different view of what MPs were before I went to Iraq and then after, right? And so I think folks don't realize some of the things you're describing here, just like dig into them for a second. I mean, the fact is, military police is one of the rare branches of the Army where companies deploy individually outside of battalions, meaning I think that, you could be plucked to do any mission, even off schedule with the rest of your battalion, if the battalion even has a schedule, 4 or 5 companies in the same battalion could be doing totally different missions and not even on the same timeline. But the other thing is, like you said, you might not know what you're doing until you get to Iraq or until you're on your way. And then it may change halfway through the deployment, or it may change 2 times. But the range of what MPs do, I mean, look, even an infantry unit can get a job like training an Iraqi battalion on some big base, and that's pretty safe. But that's more rare. It seems to me that, from what I can understand, and tell me if I'm wrong, that the normal way of doing business in the MPs during the height of the Iraq War, especially, is you could be doing everything from fixed stationary kind of guard duty, although that became less common out of necessity, at a pretty safe site. Or you could be running convoys every day more than the infantrymen, braving, the snipers and the gunfire and the IEDs, and even fighting side by side with infantry and cav units, and also the Iraqi security forces units, because, as people may not realize, police, what we call police in Iraq, were soldiers' targets every day, right? And it was war, just like in Afghanistan. So, I mean, maybe just if you have just any like additional comments on the unique, to a certain extent, a large extent, the unique experience of being an MP as a job, and of being an MP from 2004 to 2012 at the height of the 2 wars till the surges ended.
Well, it always changed very quickly. I know you've mentioned that you lived in I think 3 or 4 places each deployment, or I know Iraq was just several different places, and I lived at 3 or 4 different camps on my first tour, and then 3 my second. And so each of those moves went into, the mission would change, even if we were, because at one point we were convoying from a bigger camp down to our area in Diwania, which is kind of the AO that I was in on my first tour. It's about 3 hours south of Baghdad. Crap, what was I talking about?
Moving around a bunch. And,
moving around. So, but and then at one point, we were living in the city in a defunct medical college with the battalion the cav battalion that we were attached to. And it was kind of weird. There was like 33 of us in one giant room, and we managed to make it work. But that kept changing over and over and over again. Always convoys. There's always somebody that needs protecting, and we could easily drop in for that. And the thing about importance in the military with missions and stuff is that you see when a higher priority one comes in, that the lower thing almost can just get swept off the table. And then you start to ask yourself, was it really that important to begin with, if it can so easily be dismissed by what just happened? I think about more stuff about MPs. But no, the sky is really the limit. We had guys, they weren't in my platoon, but on my second tour, we had a team that went to work with Navy SEALs. They were doing EPW, enemy prisoner of war work, doing searches and keeping prisoners together before they could get picked up. So it could really go in almost any direction. But that means that how is an MP supposed to have really a really good grasp of mission tasks if they're always changing, if they're always morphing, if there's always these different exceptions, and trying to accept when bad things would happen with the Iraqi police, that equipment would go missing, that guys wouldn't show up for patrol, and we weren't really trained very much on training people. We weren't trained as police trainers, although we did do a lot of that. But it was usually we had to fall in on whatever mission that happened to come up right there. And then and like what you mentioned, Danny, about the period about from 2004 to 2012. There's so much that happens in there that really, really hammers the MP Corps. You have the Abu Ghraib scandal, which was huge and involved not people I knew personally, but in terms of leaders. A colonel I served under, that he was out of Fort Bragg, ended up doing part of the investigation into that when it happened. But they were the guys at Abu Ghraib were National Guard guys, and they had no decent leadership, and they also weren't trained. And so, they show up there and like all these horrible things are happening. Well, it's not an excuse for their inhumanity, but did you actually train them to not do this? Did you train them on how to actually deal with prisoners? And the other part of that is in terms of the mindset of the MP Corps, that we're supposed to care for our prisoners. They're our responsibility. And yet there were people within the MP Corps that were willing to look the other way on certain things. And that's something I'd actually like to research a lot more. But then you have, we were already stretched super thin with the invasion up through '05. And like I mentioned about my 2 years, is everybody else was on 12 and 12. They got 12 on a deployment, or 15 potentially when they went to 15-month deployments. And sometimes it was 18. There were guys in OIF1 in the initial wave who were part of the wave in March of '03 and were still in country of June of '04 and longer. Mechanics, guys, any kind of cyber unit, anything that involved computers and required more time for setting up. Um, yeah, it just made absolutely no sense. Um, Double checking, Danny, am I still answering your question?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think an interesting follow on that I hadn't written down, but right before I get to that, you mentioned that it was March of '03 that we have the invasion. So we just passed the weekend that was the 18th anniversary, right? And I mean, if you would have told us back then, I don't know, maybe there were better soothsayers than we, but I mean, I know personally, if we were told me back then that there would be an 18th anniversary of that invasion with the war going on, I mean, I don't think I could have pictured it. But so you leave the Pentagon, just in terms of factual and like sequence stuff. You leave the Pentagon about what month and year your duty?
That was July of '03 that I
July of '03.
left.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the Iraq War, that first summer bump of Sunni insurgencies hitting, ODRNOs, locking up every military age Sunni male and holding their families hostage. Like, yeah, sweet old Ray ODRNO, right? That was happening when he was the 4th ID commander.
One of our sister companies did did protective details for Paul Bremer when they were first in country, the 571st they did, and so we got to see a dash of him, just a little bit, kind of behind the scenes. But yeah, very absolutely right there in the forefront.
So then you leave. What month do you get into Iraq? What month year?
February '04.
Okay, so February '04. Yeah, so you're there 2.5 years, before I am, right? Despite the fact that we go into the military around the same time. Uh, in that period, right? Maybe okay. So 18 years ago this weekend, what was your general view of the invasion? Efficacy, rightness, wrongness, and then in the brief interim when it's really, really real between July '03 and February '04, when it's like I'm going. What was your view then, and was it any different at all?
Um, I didn't know what to expect when it began, and I want to say, that was definitely the experience of 90 to 95% of the people in the unit. We had maybe 5 or 6 guys that had a combat patch, usually from the Gulf War, but a few other places, Panama and such. Um, but we didn't know. We were all just kind of jaw dropped, just because we're trying to absorb what we're seeing on the news, because the army doesn't keep you in the loop about things. It even if you wanted to, there's no site that you could go to and here's the latest info the army is teaching its soldiers about speaking Arabic or something. No, that doesn't happen um, at all with any regularity. But the barracks we were living in was our staging area where we parked our trucks was adjacent to Arlington National Cemetery. And so every day when we went to shift, you were greeted with it, and it's if listeners, if you've never gone and seen a map of Arlington and just how big it is and all the different things that it touches in terms of it, because it's expanded a lot over the years, but it was an incredibly sobering experience watching guys who had fallen in Iraq coming to get buried. That was also at the same time that the Space Shuttle Columbia exploded, and so the astronauts, that there were 2 or 3 of them that were interred at Arlington. And so it was very much in our face what the reality was. Is that we didn't know what was happening in Iraq, but we knew the outcome for people that wore the uniform. It became a more personal, a more visceral fear and wanting to understand, what we could do to protect ourselves. And combat is unforgiving in that way. People may die from an IED explosion. People may die because the driver turned too sharp and rolled over the truck. Both of those are very, very plausible, but we don't think of the accidents that are non-combat, in terms of, is it less manly? Um, should we just put the mistake on the person? Whereas if the enemy does all the killing, there can't be any blame on this side, ostensibly. So, um, when I got, and then we went home, we went back to Fort Lewis, and I went to NCC for a month. And I kid you not, the month that I spent at NTC was harder than any one month I spent in Iraq, minus being in combat, minus the actual firefights, long hours, shitty food. It's an entirely different kind of desert. The kind of desert in Southern California is much more mountainous and rugged, whereas the desert in Iraq is, there's little hills, but there's no mountains. And some places are sand and some places are just rock. Um, but no, I think I was in too much of a fear state to really be asking any harder questions about it. We would meet up. We had a thing in the chow hall where our sergeant major told us, 2 months before we're going, hey, this is what I know right now. This is our approximate date. This is approximately when we'll be coming home. This is what we're expecting to do, but that can change. And we were all very much caught up in the human parts of it, missing our family, having to, all the preparation that goes into a deployment, all the things that soldiers have to do. They set up these little lots to park your cars in if you don't have, family to hang on to your car while you're in deployment, and all of that takes time. But no, I was very much too in the moment in that time to really have harder questions. Once my first tour in Iraq was done, the only concrete determination that I had made was, we're not helping. What we do here is not a net positive for these people or for us. It's just not. And so I knew that regardless of the politics, if I had to do it again, which I did go back to Iraq again, that my focus was going to be much more on protecting my guys and not hurting anybody than it was going to be trying to go after anything. And you can see that dynamic with different leaders. I finished reading a book called First Platoon recently, and it combines stuff about Clint Lawrence and his war criminal case with understanding a term called identity dominance. Something I've actually wanted to ask you about, Danny. But anyways, they were trying to use biometric data to try to convince people so Trump would give Clint Lawrence a pardon. But when you get into a little bit more nitty gritty about him as a person, he only had 5 weeks left in his deployment, and he just came from a talk, was what we call our little bases, tactical operations center, where all the radios and computers and all the technology that keeps convoys on the road is all concentrated, and the other LTs were making fun of him. And so between that and the fact that he was gay, there was definitely a tough man quotient that he was trying to go after. And that was one that I entirely rejected, because it didn't make a difference. Big muscly guys bleed and get shot the same as anybody else. Same with talking about women, being too weak. There are tons of pasty white guys that are about my size that are weaker than the women, but yet we end up focusing on whether or not they can. I mean, can the average person just randomly throw up a 230-pound guy with all his gear and haul him out of an armored vehicle before it explodes? I don't know. But it's not certain. It's not a infallible fact. but no, I think that was the one kind of hold on one second. The one kind of dissent that I participated in when I was still in service was, I know this mission isn't worth it. I don't want anybody to get hurt, and I'm going to run as fast as I fucking can towards both those goals. And that was it. And once we got home, you know, things definitely did change for me, but
Well,
but
before you talk that, if you don't mind, I wanted to, because you hit on something interesting that I didn't write down until we started, when we started talking about the unique nature of MPs, and I think it's super important. I mean, some might say that, you know, given a lot of the debates that are going on and stuff, that this is sort of like tricky or touchy ground, but we've never been really scared of that. But
no.
you know, I mean, how many? Yeah, I guess what I want to ask is about the female MP experience, the number or proportion of females that you sort of served with, um, and like your view at the time versus your view after serving with them. Because I'll just say, even from a distance, I never really served with females except like some staff, like higher staff officers, and then when I taught at West Point, just because they weren't allowed in those units at the time. But I will say that it was the military police experience, watching and serving with military police, that was transformational for like my previously obtuse and like maybe quietly, but definitely quietly chauvinistic viewpoint before, like when I was a cadet, where it was kind of like, you know, like, don't take females too seriously, certainly don't date them, you know, it was like that whole horrible culture. But you know, I had seen female MPs wounded severely. My unit had come up on an MP unit with a double amputee female military police officer. And so, I mean, for me, it was just, even from a distance as a voyeur of the military police corps, but maybe a little more than that, it was like, wow, that was transformative for me. And I can't help but wonder if it was the MP experience in Iraq specifically, maybe Afghanistan, that helped really move the needle on females in combat. Because when the casualties went high up for the non-combat, traditional combat units like infantry, it was truck drivers like 88 Mikes, and it was MPs. But the thing about the truck drivers is, for the most part, they faced IEDs, maybe snipers, but they were in their vehicles. Yeah. The MPs were the real like combat support element that was in firefights, like what we think of as traditional combat. So anyway, that was just something that jumped at me about the MP experience. And maybe you could talk a little about what your view of, you know, females in the units were before, after, during.
I knew I met a new female soldiers who wanted to, within the confines of that section of the military at that time, who wanted to get as close to combat as they could. And being an MP was one of those places. You know, aside from that, you know, aside from the, you know, the little bit of a program that they're trying to do for special forces and other jobs trying to get more females into, but females being a part of combat around me was a part of my entire enlistment. You know, I went from high school where, you know, girls can do everything that the guys can do for the most part, in terms of rules and stuff. And so when I entered the MP Corps, the makeup of my unit, it was certainly more diverse than what I had in my home small town, but I didn't bat an eye that some of my comrades were females. It didn't bother me in the least. And like I just mentioned, you know, that it seems like that automatic assumption that people make that they're less tough, they're less strong, they're less emotionally able to handle it. And I didn't experience that at all. You know, that, and especially because of the climate, you know, not only the unforgiving nature of the Army as an institution, period, but the unforgiving nature when you're a female in the Army. A good example of that, and it's, you know, it definitely was contrary in different places. When I went on my second tour, when we first got to Iraq, I had a female soldier in my team. We ended up going to Al Anbar, which was being patrolled and covered by the Marine Corps at that time. And the Marine Corps very strictly does not let females in anything close to combat. But they were concerned about that. But more than that, they were concerned that they were just kind of throwing fresh meat to a pack of wolves. You know, a boys will be boys kind of thing. And I really hated that. I really did. I hated the fact that they plucked my soldier from my team, who I was, you know, it takes time to get used to new people. You have to learn about them. And I was one of those NCOs who wanted to know my guys. I wanted them, you know, I wanted to be that support in their lives that I didn't have at times when I was a younger soldier. But no, they're tough as hell. You know, they certainly had their places where they were even more helpful, because dealing in Muslim culture, you need a female to search a female, and so that was something every once in a while. One of our female soldiers would get plucked out from the platoon and go and do, you know, a couple days of missions, and that was what they were doing, is they were helping search females so that we could make that cultural difference a little less stingy. Um, but and then now, what I know now, I didn't experience this myself, but I saw the way that soldiers and even leaders, even somewhat higher leaders, had this accepting predatory line of looking at women, and I did not see them that way. You know, if somebody worked for me, to me they're off limits. That's really unfair to do that, and there's a whole bunch of other layers to that, but that was base one for me. um but I'm grateful that the MP Corps made a place for those people, those soldiers that wanted to get closer to combat, because they sure as hell were going to find it. um but I hope that even in my anti-war stance that I am in now, I hope that the military becomes much more welcoming in that way. Because even if we disagree in anti-war sense, we still want the military to be a place that doesn't dehumanize people just because of the nature of its existence, just because you're in there. And I saw people being soldiers, female soldiers, being sexually harassed. My ex-wife was harassed by an NCO of hers, and I had to restrain myself from going and dealing with him. He did outrank me, but I really didn't give a fuck about that. Um, but it was a reality. It was a very harsh reality. And then move to today, where we understand that, you know, a lot of times is kind of like that dude, that captain that was Oliver Stone's commander, and he, you know, he watches platoon and he's like, none of this happened in my deployment. It's like, if the idea didn't happen in front of the person's brain, they can't accept that it's a reality. And that was very much in terms of female treatment. You know, I didn't see that. I didn't see those kind of things when I was in. Well, that was because you didn't see them. That doesn't mean that they weren't there.
I don't know a single, like, I was pretty fortunate to work with a lot of females. I think because I was in the intelligence community, there tends to be more females in it.
Yeah, yeah.
And but like, I don't know a single woman, you know, that I served with that wasn't harassed, assaulted, at the very least harassed, at the very least like made, you know, comments, or people, you know, they go to sit down and there's some, like, the guy that they're sitting in the space with, his hand is there. Like Mary talked to us about that, and it's like stupid shit like that that just gets swept under the rug so much that so many people, they don't want to talk about it. And it's like, now we're in the space where women can serve in literally every role. There's no, and like, I'm so glad that that's the problem. But then people are feeling like, oh, well, we're like, you know, we're going to do the same thing with racism. It's like, oh, we're done. Like, sexism
Yeah, yeah.
conquered. And it's
The
like,
goal has been achieved. The thing, and very much like,
yeah.
you know, dealing with someone's mental health, is that we have to continually update and move to better. We have to always be trying to
Mhm.
go towards doing something better. That the U.S. military so dehumanizes both women and people of color, but especially women, in terms of the MST factor into it. Um, you know, that something that I tried it. I don't say it as often as I should, but that if we're trying to educate people to be more human, they have to accept themselves as human more often, and they have to accept the people in their little circle. If we want veterans to feel for Iraqis, we have to first get them to accept the people that were closer to them. Because I think that that's the journey. You know, we value those people's lives that are next to us, and then we also end up connecting that to the people that we actually go serve operations near. And I don't think that, you know, you can't honor a female soldier and go treat a female Iraqi like shit. You know, is that where, how does the cognitive dissonance not just fucking crawl out your ears and wave at you like this. It's beyond me. But I think that that's a really important thing, and especially with understanding the nature of the military in terms of being able to change the civilian side. Knowing what Harry Truman's choice to reintegrate the military did, that it forced a little bit of change that eventually it wasn't the only thing that brought about the civil rights movement, but there was a definite connection there.
So, speaking of many females being tougher than men, which can itself be like a sort of version of stereotyping, which I'm about to do more of. That's fun. But yeah, so I want to make one comment and then ask one question, and then Keagan's going to close it out from there, because one of the much tougher females in my life, who would have been stoic as hell in combat while I was breaking down, will kill me if I'm late for school pickup again. But the thing that you said that was interesting about women and the way they're valued, or the lack thereof, it became really apparent to me when I went back to teach at West Point, when I found that for the most part, okay, there are always exceptions, my female cadets and even my male cadets of color, right? So a variety of different backgrounds besides white male, tended to come in with a much more like open-minded and broader view of things, like a little bit less pigeonholed. And that's not always the case, but I mean, mathematically, the hundreds of cadets that I taught, it was definitely a trend. And it's interesting because it's also the same goes for like homosexuals to a certain extent, because or just people who aren't cisgender, right, or any of that, because with Don't Ask, Don't Tell, we pushed out so many gay and lesbian soldiers, a disproportionate number of whom were in things like linguists and cultural awareness kind of jobs. And then of course we found out a few years later in Iraq and Afghanistan, like, man, we really wish we had those. And so I mean, there's a part of me that wonders when it comes to the Iraq war and stuff in general, it's like, who thought that sending mainly white boys from Alabama and Montana in infantry units, right? Because like, let's be real, statistically, that's the disproportionate, that's who they are, right? They're not all bad guys, but like, is that really who we wanted to send to like recreate society? So that's the first thing. But the question I have, and you guys can talk that, but and I'll listen to the answer, of course, I'm really interested, is between the deployments you have about 2 years, and I guess I'm interested, and I think viewers will be interested to know the state, the evolving state of your sort of emotional and physical health, the extent that you're comfortable talking about your personal life, romantic relationships experience in that period, and then just anything that kind of falls into the broad category of like PTSD related symptoms. I guess what I'm asking is, what was your life like, right? 360 on a fairly personal, but also somewhat professional level in those 2 years between the two deployments. Yeah, and with that, I'll let kind of Keagan take the follow-ons to that. But I think people will be interested to know. It's tough stuff, by the way. I mean, you know me, I'm going to push, right?
It's all good, man. It's all good. No, I made that joke with the episode description for yours, and in the same vein, I think that if we're not searching for truth or greater truth, if we want to call it that, I don't know that there's a point in living. I think that everybody should try to do better, and especially when it comes to people. So time after my first tour in Iraq, the first 6 months or so, we were essentially gearing up to go back, which my company, that company did deploy to Afghanistan the following winter. So if I had stayed in my land and P company, I would have been on a 12 and 12 split back and forth again. And so I was very grateful for that. A good friend of mine at the time, Chris Henri, he came over to the drug team with me. So we were the two new guys, but we were together, which made that a little bit easier. But honest to God, I was too busy with trying to just get through my own life, trying to get used to working on the drug team. And then somewhere in the back of my mind that I didn't think about often, but was very pressing, was the reality of going again. And what are the odds that I don't get hurt, that I don't get, don't get PTSD. And at the time, I didn't see that part of it in myself as much. I was also, I got married in that 2 years, and my son Sean was born, and my ex and I had a lot of issues, and that made it made life quite a bit harder than it needed to be. I mentioned to her, she used to be a line MP too, and she got out because she had our son. And I was trying to impress on her that, I have an office job now. I get most weekends off. I get to do something that I enjoy more in terms of the actual doing of it. Please help me appreciate this. And I won't put that all on her. I had my own issues. I had my own stuff going on, but I was too busy worrying about the next thing to think about the last thing. Um, and then, for me, it wasn't until I think 2011 where a whole bunch of personal and social things kind of fell out from under me, and I absolutely knew that I needed someone to talk to, someone to to do something. Um, and that was the beginning of me of actually going and speaking to a therapist and trying to figure that out. But I was, I made a lot of mental excuses. There are times where I would be really angry or just really curt with people, just really forceful, and why did you do that? And I didn't realize this, that I was creating that environment around me a bit because I was projecting it onto my family where I was living at the time. Um, but as far as the awareness of the war, that know that it carried on as poorly as it had when I was there the entire time, and I felt a little bit I deserved a break from understanding more of the pieces, trying to save my own psyche a little bit. But I also knew that if my career aspirations went in the direction I thought they were going to, becoming a CID agent meant getting deployed quite a bit, even more than being an MP. And you can kind of see the results of 2 decades of that with reading the Fort Hood report, that CID is severely undermanned and underqualified for the stuff that they're doing. And like mentioning that even if we're going to have a military, let it be one that's accepting and welcoming and protective of all of its soldiers, including females and people of color. Um, Crap, what was I talking about? Um, but
What was your main, like, when you were so you interacted with the Iraqis a lot, and like you got to see a good amount of their life and what their existence was like over the time period of us. And so, like, in the difference between your initial foray into Iraq and then later, like, what was your impression of the life of the people and their general sentiment towards you as an American soldier?
um, generally they were pretty kind to us, and I had no reason to have any animosity towards any of them. That they generally were as kind as they could be, and Iraqi culture, that they're very stern sense of welcoming somebody into their home. And so that I remember one of our squads having dinner at the police chief's house, and I wasn't in sitting at the dinner, but they brought me a plate out to eat when I was I was up in the gun doing security. um but yeah, they tried to be kind. um the problem is that in Iraqi culture, it's difficult to criticize someone. That they Criticism is kind of supposed to be more tepid and more subtle. And so the kind of criticism you get from a loud sergeant first class isn't the kind that they really do there. And it takes, for that reason, because of that sensitivity, if you're trying to criticize something specific, you meet with the police chief and your guys are doing this particular thing when they patrol in this area, can you please get them to stop? That might have been a number of conversations to actually completely achieve that goal, because of that distance, and also because of our ignorance about it. I didn't learn that from the army. I learned that from dealing with the Iraqis. Um, but more than that, I saw them just as people. These are people, the high level of poverty there was very new to me. So I didn't really know what to make of that. But what I saw was people trying to go on with their lives in whatever way that they can. And but like I mentioned earlier, is that, um, I wanted all of our guys to come home, and I wanted to hurt no one. I wanted to be involved in hurting and um, trying to control, anyone. And I really, really wanted that to be that to be a reality. And part of it is because in general, I value people. I haven't gone to church in a really long time, but I recently realized that so many of the things that I did learn in church as a young kid really stuck with me. Treat your neighbor as you treat yourself is a very big one. Because you don't know the full story. That we look at people and we think that we can understand them by whatever our experience is, and we don't spend enough time listening, which for me, being a more passive person, is a great thing because I end up spending a lot more time listening. And so I think I have a better chance to understand that because I don't always push my opinion in. But then there are other times where I miss out because I step too far back. So
I love that story that when we went to VetSpar and the VA chaplain was asking you that question about like your like what I don't know if this was your first or second deployment, but that story that you told about the fact that you were driving the Humvee and your I don't know if it was your superior next to you, but they were telling you to
yeah,
just like you're supposed to keep going when there's people in the way, and you're like you didn't want to kill, like you had that mindset of like I don't want to hurt anybody. And like did you get any fallout from that? Was anybody like pissed off at you, or did they try to get you for anything, or were they just like whatever about it?
nobody tried to get me for anything. My team leader did. He didn't smoke me, do have to do push-ups or anything like that, but he was really upset and he did yell at me. But it was very short-lived. And looking back on it now, I think that his anger was more about the fear. That was at a point
Right.
in Iraq when car bombs were just prolific. We could not, and it was really terrifying because we knew that I had been hit by an IED and it happened to not penetrate my truck. I knew that for everybody who might have gotten killed or maimed by an IED, there are however many others that didn't go off, or if they did go off, they only caused a small amount of damage. But as earlier mentioning in terms of the damage of combat versus the damage of soldiers being stupid, rolling over a truck, or and what you just referred to, which is I really like the story, but it's a painful inflection point for me. But I think that is one of the key points that I hang on to now, thinking in an anti-war sense. And I don't know that I've told that story. If it's all right, I can tell it again real quick so everybody can have an
Yeah,
idea
yeah.
of it. And I haven't told too many stories about my time in, occasionally here and there, but um so like I mentioned, it was a period when car bombs were, we were just absolutely gut checked, worrying and watching, so we're headed back to our camp.
This is your second deployment?
First deployment. This is my first deployment.
First.
So we're heading back into camp, and sometimes we would leave camp 4 or 5 times in a day. We had different places, different meetings with leaders there, or some other mission, or we had to go to a different base and meet with somebody. So it was a path and a place that we drove through a lot. And at the time, I was in the rear vehicle and I was driving an ASV. It's called an armored security vehicle. It's almost 3 times as heavy as a Humvee, as a combat loaded Humvee.
Oh,
But it has, we could tow trucks, and there was a lot of other stuff we could do too. Those were fun, aside from the fires, which I can talk about another day. But so anyways, this car is going to cut us off because Iraqi drivers just drive. There isn't really, I don't know anyone that follows any kind of established anything. They want to drive sometimes on the wrong side of the road. They it just happens. And so I'm guessing that for most people there, it's kind of a guess and check thing. Can I really drive that way? Okay, I'm going to follow this guy. He seems a little less insane. But that was kind of the mentality of it, and we tried to give other cars a little more of a wide berth for that reason. But then there were other times where we were more aggressive, and we would pit cars and knock them onto the shoulder, because we wanted to maintain enough distance for ourselves. But anyway, so car pulls in front of us, and I slam on the brakes. And again, this is 15 tons coming to a stop, and so it's a damn hard lurch. And we didn't come super close. We were at least 15 feet from the car, so we weren't quite that close. Um, and I looked at the car, and it was I don't remember the kind, but it was a smallish sedan. It had like 7 people in it. If I had kept going, I would have killed at least one of them, maybe all of them, because the truck probably would have at some point, with the inertia, just gone over the car itself. And I look back on that, and like, came so close, and there was no combat related danger to that. There was nothing that was going to happen to us. It was just the environment and the fear. And I don't remember what I told my team leader after that. I might have just taken my ass chewing and gone on with my day. And there were other times where I did things. There was one night where we slid off the road into a bigger ditch, and we didn't roll over. And later that night, he gave me an attaboy for, hey, you kept us alive. We didn't roll over. We didn't get hurt. Some of those trucks, depending on the weight and stuff, you have to learn different ways to drive. Some you really have to give it some gas to get going. Some it takes just a little bit, but each change, you have to adjust for that. But I think about that. I think about how easy it would have been for me to hurt those people. And then I think about what would have been the actual fallout. Would my leaders have stood up for me if that happened, if they believed that it was truly that kind of a danger, which I don't think it was, but that doesn't mean that the danger can't be articulated in a report of some kind for somebody to read somewhere else that wasn't there. But
So
no,
like when you got out, or when was like your real descent into like, I am firmly against this and now I want to do something about
that came much later. I was knee deep in trying to figure out my own pain and stuff, during the Afghan surge. I didn't really keep, and Afghanistan, it wasn't that it didn't seem important to me, but I didn't know nearly enough. I didn't have the same connection and experience as I did with Iraq. So, I kind of would check the news and like, what this is happening in Iraq and that's happening in Iraq. And, um, news headlines don't always show the actual reality, but you could see the descent over time. But the thing that really brought me into it, was Ferguson. That when Michael Brown was killed and the response of the police departments there, I saw this connecting between of military and police, and it terrified the shit out of me. And as time went on from there, I continued to kind of, looking at police brutality and looking, um, at those military connections. And then Bernie came around, and again, Bernie's, some people have been Bernie bros for a long time. Admittedly, Bernie bro right here. Call it, put it in text. I don't care. I like the man. I don't follow him as a god, but not that he wouldn't make a really cool statue. Receding hairline, nice little gold glasses, or maybe with his mitten thing. I don't know. But the things that he said, the things that he brought around, talking about income inequality, and then not as much as domestic issues, but when he would bring up foreign issues and make those connections, I started thinking there's more to this that I'm not taking time with. I haven't taken time with, and I need to. And so during the 2016 race, I was trying to absorb as much as I could. I wouldn't say that I was anti-war at that point. But at the end of 2017 is when we started the podcast. And it's since then that has been my real education in the US military, in our foreign policy, writ large, and in the domestic effect on people like us, on the portion, the slice of the war that we carry with us. You're someone that did not actively, you weren't in combat, but that doesn't mean you weren't part of the force. That doesn't mean that um, you easily make those connections. I know the operations I worked on, seeing, in terms of, the whole thing, that when Iraqis get killed and it's connected to the Americans, it's we did this. We have abdicated that role. We've allowed Congress to abdicate that role to reign in the military, to reign in the executive branch in those times. Um, but like I said, the slice of war that you have is real. And since we've started the podcast, there's so many other topics that I follow now, things to look for in terms of the military. I don't read normal news very much anymore. I mean, I do, for research on topics and things, but um, I'm so much more skeptical. I kind of wish I could tattoo skeptical right here and just make people read it when I meet them. Um, and I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for that skepticism. But at first I'd wondered, like, did it have its own, where did this really originate? And I did have a very deliberate path, between Osama bin Laden getting killed, the Afghan surge, Ferguson, um, it's about the inhumanity. It's that, not even for domestic stuff, is that most Americans seem like they hate other Americans, unless they're so similar to them. To explain to somebody that you believe that free speech means protecting speech that you yourself hate, not very many people believe that. They believe that their speech is okay and maybe some speech like them, but they don't look at the opposite side of it. And that's what people need to be able to do with our military. You need to be able to really look at, if there were columns of Humvees and tanks rolling down your roads, if there were drones overhead that made your children terrified, what would you do? Would you sit there and take it, or would you fight back? And we have to get that across to more people, that the people have to be willing to think of the opposite situation. If something is good for you, it may invariably be bad for somebody else. But we don't take that. And I want to be a completionist in that way. I want to be somebody that, if I learn a subject, I try to learn pieces and parts of all of it. Like right now, I consider myself a bit of a budding socialist. And so I'm trying to find texts and things that can explain different aspects of it to me, and to look at it from different ways, which means learning stuff takes a lot longer these days, but I learn a lot more comprehensively. I can understand things in a bigger picture. Um, Hope I answered
Same.
your
I
question.
feel the same way.
Um,
No, it's so frustrating, right? Because like when you talk to people who are from these countries, you talk to people from Iraq, from Syria, from Yemen, which not a lot of Americans get the opportunity to do.
no.
Like, you see, we have fucked up an entire region for generations.
Hmm.
And like talking to millennials from Syria, like my brother is in Turkey right now. He's living there. He's in Istanbul, and like, he's meeting all these amazing people that are from, a lot of people from the Middle East, like on their way to different places. Like, it's always been like that cultural like melting pot, because Turkey's the gateway to Europe.
Sure.
So it's always been like a really cool pass through place. And, I talked to him about, him being an American there, and like what it's like. And then when you talk to folks from these areas, and how, just like you said, like Arabic culture is so much about being welcoming, and
Hmm.
like being good hosts, and like caring about your guests, and like not caring about like even little things, like, this girl like that he's been hanging out with is like bringing over cookies, and he was like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I took some of your cookies," and she was like, "What do you mean my cookies? Like, I brought them over for you." And like that, like just that weird concept of privatization of like everything, that we're so focused on America, and are so like, as you said, like we only care about free speech unless it offends our sensibilities, and
Yeah.
then we don't
Yeah.
care. or if it's not something we agree with. And like that kind of mentality is anathema to people who have been in serious trauma for their entire lives. And like so many Americans just don't understand how fucking privileged we are to be in this place where we've never had to worry about someone coming in and invading our country, or just like, you know, sure, we've had random terrorist bombings occasionally, but like nothing in comparison to having an entire infrastructure, an entire society break down because of violence that was put on them. Like we have no fucking clue. And I'm with you, dude. It's like we have to be able to translate our experiences, which again are just a small piece of the pie, but we have this experience that so many Americans don't have and don't want to have because they don't want to confront that, you know, how damaging our military has been. And it's like, fuck, we have to do something about that. So with that, I would love to ask, like, what do you feel like is your hope for the future? Like, do you feel like we have the opportunity, because we've been in this pandemic for a year and some people just want us to like fuck off and go back to doing whatever we want. But I think a lot more people are realizing all the shit that has led us to this point, and these systemic problems that put us in, that made the situation so much worse than it should have been. You know, you look at like Vietnam, that had, you know, they had a lower death rate than we did by far, a lower case rate by far, and that's per capita too. That's like not saying because of population, that's per capita. You know, you look at, it's just insane. Like we handled this terribly because the people that make money didn't want us to do the things that we needed to do. And so like for me, it's hard to see really a way out of that doesn't, like, that isn't going to be serious upheaval, which I don't want. That I don't want people to go out there and take what they want by force, you know, because then we're not going to be any better. But I don't know, it's hard for me to see a lot of ways like what the future is when you have these people that have so much money and resources, and they are concerned with centralizing that and maintaining and growing it. And it's like, and so for me, it's hard to see like, how do we come back from that? But what do you feel like are the ways that we can push on that?
I would definitely reiterate what I mentioned earlier about that. If we can get, you know, and this is specific for service members, but for all people, is that we have to learn to just value human life separate from the person. We have, you know, that what was the thing that Bernie said, that be willing to do something helpful or kind for someone that you've never met, you know, that you don't know, you don't understand their hardships, that we end up looking at it from did I get the same thing that everybody else got? Did I get the benefit? Did I get the thing? Versus what way can
And not getting anything back from it, just being good and getting something, you know.
But the you know, there's a lot of bridges that I think need to be burned to create space for some real legitimate change. One that I haven't thought about a lot, but I think would just be an easy conclusion, a natural conclusion, is that military officers and that we're not allowed to work for military contractors, essentially. And I don't mean like, you know, like work at the base level. You know, somebody has to be security for somebody, or they're working for KBR or whatever. I'm talking about the general pipeline from being a
The
4-star
revolving door.
to
Yeah.
being on the board of General Dynamics or Raytheon or whoever it happens to be. I think that we have to find a way to separate ourselves. We have to separate from the idea of profit in that way. You know, that we, instead of having this, I don't want to call it extra money, but instead of having this money, we have Medicare for all. Instead of having this money, we have free college. You know, that's kind of, I mean, it's a good suggestion, but I don't, you know, it's not as powerful for change. But it goes back to, you know, Americans have enough trouble hating Americans. For people that don't live in America, it's that much worse. and the pushback from the system is just unbelievable. That the Carter, when Jimmy Carter wrote the Carter Doctrine, talking about wanting understanding that most of the world's oil was there, and that I think it was like the success of the Middle East is our success. Them having stable countries, good relations, good economic policies, that protects us in addition to them. And then you see this slow drag over the 80s and 90s, and then culminating with the beginning of the Iraq War, where that kept getting pushed. Reagan doing stuff with Iran-Contra, the Gulf War invasion, the sanctions, and the drone bombings and Air Force bombings in Iraq. And then finally we arrived at W, and W said, "Hold my beer. This is what's going to happen." But I, even if it's a bit flawed, I would applaud Carter on that kind of thing, because it takes a lot of bravery, especially if you're going to say anything positive about certain countries that we're supposed to hate. Iran being usually the number one, but there's certainly other ones. North Korea and Syria fit into that as well. But shouldn't we say, if we have the most powerful military in the world and we keep sending so many troops to the Middle East, why wouldn't the simple solution just to be to say what Carter said, that their success will be our success because we'll have access to oil, and we won't have to send our troops there because there's no chance of them coming here to hurt us. They live in a good country. They don't live within, being sorry, I'm dropping the word, but being scared and being, all the time, all of their lives, not knowing, having to move between refugee camps and shit. But I think that's where we need to be. I think we need to be able to say that whatever country they're, if they're stable, that adds to our stability. And that includes Russia and China.
Just look at the math.
Yeah.
Look at the math. Like, extremism doesn't flourish in good countries. It doesn't flourish in places where people feel safe, they feel happy, they feel secure, they feel like a sense of motivation and a sense of the ability to move ahead and like get what they want out of life. Like, because that's what extremism preys on. It preys on those people that feel disadvantaged, they feel let down, they see no path forward, and some person, usually a guy, an older guy, comes in with money and says, "Hey, like, let me give you those things that you're lacking in your immediate life, and let me tell you who's to blame for all your problems." And like, it's the same everywhere. And it makes me sad that like I see us devolving into that as more people are frustrated. And especially as us, like as cisgendered straight white dudes, there's a lot of people who are in our group that are feeling that same way. They feel like they're somehow like everyone else's gain is their loss. And it's like, no, like there's like, I just want us to get rid of that fear of lack, of that fear of like, oh my God, if I don't have something, then if I give it to this guy, then I'm not going to have it. And it's like, fuck you. Like, that's not where we live.
Yeah.
Like we could do so much more, especially because of our place in the world as Americans, but also just the fact that like, if we wanted to live up to our values of freedom and democracy, and those words have been twisted so much, but if we wanted to live up to those, to the living of the pursuit of happiness, it means giving people the things that they need to survive and then giving them the ability to move forward.
Yeah.
And it's like, fuck you. Like I'm just so tired of people that don't get that. It's like we are making it worse because we're denying it to ourselves, because like you said, we hate ourselves, and like that sense of violence, the desensitization to violence that we have in America makes me really sad. But I do hope like if we have these points to make these monumental shifts, and they have to make a decision. Like, are you on the side of humanity and of living and life? Or are you on the side of continuing this path of letting people accumulate more in this weird race that doesn't mean shit after you die? Or, leaving a fucking planet for us to live on. And yeah, we have to do that.
No, being an American, to me, seems to come with an automatic expectation of a zero-sum game. And Um, I think that's why one of the problems that the left has is that there's the groups that really need the most help are not the ones that we reach out to. We do little things, small things, but it's not on that big scale. It's kind of what Vince Emanuele talked about a little bit when he was here. Um, but I think that one of the biggest things we need to do, and the recent shootings bring it out, is that we have to downgrade, ignore, or maybe even eliminate the idea of the heavy weight of personal responsibility. That
Yes.
we as a he said as a white male nation, as a Christian majority nation, we absolutely believe in that swift hammer of justice, and we have to understand that there are better patterns to follow. I'm not saying people shouldn't be charged with crimes if they do things wrong and hurt people, and but it um we have to be willing to look at the whole picture. If I was only willing to accept the experiences that I had in Iraq as the hardened ones when I talked to people, which very much kind of was how I was when I got out in 2008. I felt a bit alienated unless there were other veterans around. And that's a self-inflicted wound. That's me not recognizing what needs to happen there. Um,
Well, but you didn't have any sense of preparation for that. Like we're not
no,
prepared when
no,
we
no,
get
no,
out to feel that way. Like they don't
no.
prepare us to feel like to understand what that feeling is when we get out and we feel that isolation and that like why do all these people not give a fuck about
Yeah.
the shit that I like spent my life doing and like gave significant parts of myself to. But
Um,
yeah, like it's hard. We have to be willing to accept that. And I think I love that, like what we said with Danny at the end there. It's like we have to be willing to take a look at ourselves and like our own experiences and understand them in the broader context of this world that we're living and not
Absolutely.
try to elevate ourselves because we have personal experience. Like fuck, like that doesn't matter as much. Like yes, personal experience matters, but like it doesn't matter when you're trying to build the coalition of ideas. When you're trying
Yeah.
to build that sense of like, what do we want to move forward? Like, do we care about life or do we not? And if that's the case, then we need to like be able to step our own personal ego out of it and understand what the broader community needs.
Um, I think I don't speak about it much, partly because the idea of it really bothers me, but the meat grinder that we as a society are willing to shove our children into. Because make no mistake, you mentioned about my inexperience. I was a kid. I was 17, 18 years old. I didn't know much of anything about the world outside of my little hometown. And the powers that be were willing to shove people like you and me into that machine in a ostensible effort for defense. That's why we're doing that. And it would be different if
Right.
we lived in a period where, if it was in World War II, it's like, okay, there's some really awful things happening and I wish the war didn't exist, but this is one of those things that we have to, because we're so terrified of what the other side of the world might look like. Um, but most of the time they're avoidable. Most of the time people, it's we're willing. We want to. I don't think we want to be afraid, but I think we cling to it. Some of it human
Mhm.
survival. Some of it is back to zero sum again. I don't care. Fuck you. I don't care about you. I care about me. That shooting happened in Colorado. I've never been to Colorado. Why do I give a fuck? I don't need to change my gun laws because that happened, however that far away. Um, but we have
Right.
to,
And it's so stupid. It's like we're all humans and these things happen everywhere
yeah.
because we're humans.
But yeah, um, but no, that there's a very dense and powerful moral bankruptcy from taking, these new lives, these kids, and saying that their deaths, their maimings, their receipt of diseases in numerous kinds, PTSD, TBIs, um, we're saying it's worth it. we're saying that pain, that suffering, that's all that stuff is acceptable to us. And until our military can do that, until the DoD, like the VA, recognizes moral injury as real and something that soldiers carry, until we're willing to say publicly that we're not going to send troops unless they actually have a threat against our homeland, something that is concrete and tangible.
And has
I,
been debated in public
yeah,
in the
exactly. It's
like our
actually,
elected representatives.
yeah, and in going back for a second to the Carter doctrine, there was a ton of pushback. Jimmy Carter, he was I suppose considered a little bit naive, but he was a much more human president. He was somebody that really looked that way, and it's like we've been talking about, especially with environmental stuff. We have one world. When this thing is done, when we have destroyed it, and the military does a really great job every fucking day of destroying the world, even faster than it already is, we're sealing our own fate. And we're just, sometimes I feel like we're just clicking down the clock right now. And it's like, I can find happiness in my little circle of life, but I see this thing coming from way off, and it's coming, and I'm scared, and I don't know, the real crises, the real things, may not even develop until you and I are older, considerably older.
Right.
The country that we're going to see in our 70s and 80s is going to be so different, and especially with the way
If it
the
even
environment is
exists.
changing. Like right now, our sorry, our fucking southern border is closed right now. How can you do that to people? We're the ones that fucked up Central America. We're the ones that brought all that violence to bear there, and yet we're willing to just lock the door. Cool, come back in 3 months. Maybe the politics will be different and we can let some people in, as opposed to we are somewhat partially or completely responsible for why they're here. Can we please do something about it? But no, we're going to
Right.
deploy. We're going to deploy more troops to stand there with binoculars and say, "Oh, somebody's coming over there." For what? You know, it and I hope that people think about that in terms of allowing their kids to become part of the military. That not only may your kid not come back as the person that you remember, or a person that is, even if they're different, still fully formed, but doesn't have to deal with PTSD. You now also have to consider, what did that kid do on their deployments? What were they a part of? What will they, how did that actually impact anything? If we told people that we're buying ourselves a country alarm system that it says protects us but doesn't protect us, and doesn't even really acknowledge the lack of certain threats and the feasibility of real ones. We want to believe in the myth. We want to follow the myth all the way down the rabbit hole. American exceptionalism, rah rah, we're number one, everybody else sucks. We can't do it. We can't do it. We can't be
Which is
that selfish. Yeah. So,
no. Well, especially now, like the world is too connected to not see how other people live. And
absolutely.
it's unfortunate because in America, like we're so sequestered because we tend to make a lot of the media, and especially the media that we see. So our perception of what is going on in other countries is always filtered by that. Like we're never getting, unless you talk to people who are from there, you're not getting the real story. And I want more people to do that. Like I want more people to listen, to stop talking and just listen to each other, and be willing to accept things that maybe seem a little weird and maybe seem kind of funky. But like I promise you, like the more that we learn and the more that we grow as humans, the better off we will be. And that's my only hope for humanity, is that we don't have a lot of choices. We come together as a human race and we start to figure out how to actually make this planet livable, or we keep going down this stupid, selfish, short-sighted mentality of "fuck you, I've got mine," and which only leads to worse outcomes for everybody. And instead of like trying to go after them and be like, oh, I want to be one of those people that makes it, like why aspire to that? Aspire to be that person
Yeah.
who helps, that person who, it doesn't even have to be in a big way. Like I think a lot of our generation and Gen Z especially, like cares so much about, being like having an impact and like being authentic. Well, you talked about that, Danny talked about that. That's something that I think that we all really care about, because we saw those images of stuff and we were like, what is this? Like, okay, that's one way, but like, I don't know if that necessarily fits me. And I think the Gen Z kids are even more in tune with that, of like, fuck you, like I've got my identity, and like, or I'm figuring out who that is, and like I'm not going to apologize for it. And I love that. I think that's only going to help us. But then we have to take that next step of, let's expand that. Like, not you get to be yourself, but so does literally everybody else. And if we want to believe in freedom, not the freedom from, restraint to do whatever you want, but actual freedom of allowing people to express themselves and be who they want to be and live their lives, then the current system that we have doesn't work. And like I hope that we'll get to that point, that we can start to really build systems to push back against these people who want to continue to centralize and just say no. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, dude. I really appreciate you talking with us, and I appreciate everything. And I'm so glad that we get to be on this podcast together. It's been so great. We didn't get to ask any questions, but
sorry.
I wanted to ask a question about like why you started, like what made you reach out to Danny, and like that you didn't even like know him.
We can keep going for a little bit if you've got time, man. I've got nowhere to be.
Yeah,
so.
yeah. I just wanted to know.
Okay. Before I mention that, I wanted to say a few names that I've never said on the podcast before that I need to remember to discuss them more often. But thinking of Jesse Berger, who died on my first tour. He was the sole casualty that we had on our tour amongst a very combat heavy time. So that I hate saying I'm grateful we only lost one guy, because I'm not. But that was our one casualty, and there was something in my mind that was kind of like, man, we've really been so lucky, and I was just kind of waiting for the non-lucky day. I was waiting for that at some point the luck is going to run out, and I don't particularly believe in luck, but the possibilities of things. Aaron Ward, who was a replacement soldier, actually in a different platoon on my second tour. I never got the chance to meet him, but a brand new soldier got shot by a sniper. And Jesse actually died from friendly fire. It was actually determined after a long investigation that Polish soldiers that were at the checkpoint he was working at fired in his direction and shot him. And the last one I want to mention, or the last ones I want to mention, are guys that have passed since I've been out. One is Eric Baker. He was a driver in my team when I was when I was a junior enlisted soldier, and he was a great teammate to have. And he ended up joining the Navy after he left the Army, and then he developed a rare form of cancer and ended up dying. And without a doubt, some of it is very much connected to his service. But and then Joe Early and Zach Richmond have both died by suicide. And that's one thing that with the way that social media is connected these days and using the internet, that we know, or at least can pretty probably guess how those things came out, and that means that as I get older, as we all get older, that we're going to have to continue to watch that. And it's very hard to watch, but that is the reality. And I don't think enough people realize that, maybe in Vietnam, when you went back home and you didn't hear about this other buddy that you knew somewhere else every day, it made it easier to separate those things. But these days, like you mentioned, with the the internet and social media, and trying to learn more, trying to branch out, that we're able to know those things, and not just the damage it does to our former comrades, but the damage that it does in places like Iraq. I want to go back to Iraq. I want to go back and meet the people and spend time with them and talk with them about my experiences and their experiences. I really want that to happen. But anyways, can you repeat your question for
I
me?
feel so
Danny,
jealous that the
Danny.
Vietnam guys get to do that.
Yeah, no, that little bit of ignorance is a nice space, and I know there's going to be times in the future I'm like, next 6 months I'm not doing social media. I just don't want to see it. I don't want to. I'm just going to take a break. But so I had figured out that I wanted to do a podcast, but I wasn't sure. I wanted to do it with somebody else. I had seen and heard, many solo podcasters who do a really great job. Tom Secker is one of those people. He does an amazing job, but I wanted to have somebody that had similar but very different experiences, and I wanted someone that could, add to my brain bucket in that way. And so I had gotten onto reading a little bit at TruthDig and antiwar.com and a couple places, and I kept seeing this name, Danny Sjursen, Danny Sjursen, and I'm like, it's it's brilliant stuff, um, but it really pushes that skepticism button that didn't for me. And I was like, maybe he would be somebody good that could, we could kind of balance each other out. And granted, I didn't know the guy yet. I don't think I had seen any interviews of his either. So I sent him I put a reply to a tweet of his on Twitter and asked him for his email, and he gave it to me, and we started emailing, and a couple days later we talked on the phone, and we had 6 or 7 weeks of email discussions and things. What did we want to cover, what did we want to focus on? But the podcast became something entirely different than either of us, I think, expected it would. Um, but and not in a bad way. I think it's very much in a good way. But it was one of those experiences that we just had to open the airplane door and jump, and see what happened. And at first it kind of felt like it was, we were having odd conversations between each other and not sharing this with people. But then I started hearing from people. I still remember Will Arens, he was the one of the first patrons that we've ever had on Patreon, and he's been a patron ever since we started. And Will and I talked about his son and about concerns of him wanting to go into the service and what that looked like and what it could potentially do to him. And not wanting to, when dealing with teenagers, we're very contrary, we're sometimes very stubborn, so coming at it head on, I don't want you to join the military, can sometimes have an opposite effect. um, but it reminded me that there are people searching for that same truth that I am. They didn't have the same experiences as me, as you, but they understand the moral question and they don't like the answer that we're giving. That they want to latch on to that better part of America, or at least just expand their knowledge. We talk about being anti-war, and all three of us are anti-war people, but the stuff we talk about is for everybody. There may be
Yeah.
people that listen to us and like, well, I certainly don't agree with them on the anti-war stuff, but they make a lot of good points about what we're doing in Yemen, or what's happening with the all-volunteer force, or whatever it happens to be. Is that I don't want to discount people because they don't agree with me so specifically that we,
Yeah.
we need to call them out. And I think we do need to have our our boundaries that we defend, but we need to be accepting. And if I hadn't been willing to do that, I wanted to get to that higher level, and that's why I emailed Danny. That's why I went to the VetSport thing with you, which it's still very weird to me that that's the only time we've seen each other in real life. But we have seen each other in real life. Danny could still be a computer
Yeah.
animation, but you're a real person. I see you act. So,
Yeah.
But no, and I love the community of people that listen. I love the questions that they send in or the comments that they have, and I like criticism. I like knowing, hey, you were might have been kind of wrong about this. There's times where, because of my memory or trying to keep a thought in my head, that I fudge a little bit of history, and then somebody mentions it and like, oh, you're right, I was totally wrong on the year or the whatever it happened to be. Um, but no, I am immensely glad that I took that jump to contact Danny, to go to the Vet Spar thing with you, to ask you to join the podcast too, and it's become something much bigger than I thought it would be. Um, but it's hard. It's a very, we don't make easy things to listen to. This episode, what we're talking about here today, isn't easy to watch if you happen to be watching it, or to listen to at all. And I get why people get turned off from it, especially if there's someone that has bought into the American notion of exceptionalism so hard. There's a pride bite that comes in that, and I wish people could see past it. Um, but yeah, that's down and dirty of how we began the podcast.
Well, thank you so much, dude. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this, and I think this is going to be a really fun series that we're doing. I'm really glad that I like I don't know. As much as I get upset about personal experience because I feel like it can be too narrow, it is the thing that grabs you, right? It is the
It
thing
is.
that gets you to relate and gets you to think like, oh crap, like what would I feel like if I was in that position? It gets you to expand your mind more, which is what we're trying to do, right? We just want people to think about things in a broader context than what is given to them. And I'm so glad that thank you for letting me on the podcast. It's been such a great experience for me to be a part of this and to help. It's helped my own mental health absolutely to be a part of this and have a voice and to feel even if I am as minuscule as I feel like my part is, I feel like it's been inordinately helpful, and I hope that it's been the same for you and Danny.
It has. It has. My friend pool when I began the podcast was pretty shallow, and since that time has come around, that there's quite a few people, some that I keep in touch with great regularity, about all kinds of different things. And my friend Duncan Kobrick that I met, he lives in upstate New York, and his his unit was part of the Long Road Home series, and he and I discussed that. I went to his house, and we talked about that and went through the episodes and everything. And a very surreal and fucked up thing to see your story, but it's not your story. Um, but no, I am infinitely grateful and welcoming of all the people I've met, and especially you and Danny. Um, it makes the world seem bigger. It doesn't make it seem as small, especially when you have people that say, "Hey, we see this too. We see the militarism. We see the deaths. We see the tarnishing of our country." That you get into that patriotic dissent that Danny talks about in his book, that sometimes it is the most patriotic thing because it is the most opposite thing for everybody else in the room. And maybe you need to be that Jack Lemmon character in 12 Angry Men, that you stand your ground and you get people to see truth, and little bit by little bit, hopefully you can keep doing it. So
Right. And hopefully that leads us to finding ways we start with the individual connection to work towards the systemic change.
yep.
And that requires a lot, and it requires a lot of thinking, but I I'm so grateful that we get to do this, and thanks so much for doing this.
Me too, man. Me too. Thank you for the great questions and discussion. I enjoyed it, and I think the listeners will too.